Okay, so my name's Pete. Thank you for that introduction, Dame Marianne. My pronouns are he and him. My role is head of public sector membership programs at Stonewall. It's a job I'm absolutely honoured to do because I and we at Stonewall believe really passionately in the power that public services have to utterly and fundamentally transform people's lives for the better. I'm delighted to be here on this really sunny day. In what is really an incredible attendance, really, and I've got to take my hats off to BSUH for this, because it's an incredible attendance, and the agenda is setting to be a really exciting event. So absolute kudos for that. But I think this conference in itself signals the sheer commitment of the organisation to LGBT equality, I think. And more than that, it's more than just a commitment. It also represents the coming together of lots of different partners and stakeholders to address the collective obstacles and barriers that I think we face, as well as to take stock and celebrate some of the achievements. And I've got to say, it was just astounding listening to some of that report, thinking about the sheer strides that this organisation has taken in recent years. Thoroughly commendable. In terms of what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to do a bit of context setting. As Dame Marianne said, context is important, it's everything. I'm going to run through some findings from our LGBT in Britain report, which is basically a State of the Nation report that looks at all the different ways in which LGBT people experience life, and looking at particular areas of disadvantage. I'm then going to focus on the Workplace Equality Index, which is our annual benchmarking tool that we encourage all of our partner organisations to use to get valuable feedback on how they can progress their work. And I'll be talking specifically about the results of BSUH in terms of their 2019 results from that. So to kick off on some of the context around what we're doing here today, I think it's really easy to focus down on what's right in front of us, but it's also important to consider the wider context that we operate in. I also think it's important to self-reflect on where we've been, and Dame Marianne did that very clearly from an organisational point of view, and that's really important because it helps us chart where we want to go. And it's also important, I think, to be hyper-aware of the challenges that affect LGBT people, not just within an organisation, but out within wider societal domains, because no organisation, not even Stonewall, operates in a vacuum. So, Stonewall is about to reach quite a pivotal part of its history. So it was established almost 30 years ago, so it's our 30th birthday this year. Those of you who are familiar with Stonewall will know that it was founded by a group of prominent activists, including Sarah Ian McKellen in that picture, but as well as other prominent LGBT people like Lisa Power and Michael Cashman. And it was established in response to Section 28, which was a really pernicious piece of the Local Government Act that was introduced back in 1988. So Stonewall as a lobbying group was founded particularly in response to that legislation. For those of you who aren't aware of what Section 28 was, it was a clause that basically precluded public sector bodies from even talking about same-sex relationships and even acknowledging their existence. And it caused a lot of teachers in the teaching profession, for example, to leave their jobs because of fear of persecution or disciplinary action at the time. And it really set a quite damaging precedent for British society in relation to sexual orientation and diversity. I remember, I'll take for compliment on the age comment, but I think it is important to think about how recent some of these changes are actually, because it was only about 16 years ago when I was in school, in secondary school, and I was being bullied for being gay, and I remember so clearly those days when I could see teachers literally turning a blind eye to some pretty acute homophobic bullying at school. And so I may look young, but actually it just goes to show how far we've come in what's a really, in such a short space of time, really. But it did more than just damage people's lives at the time. It also set a legacy of punity, of shame, of secrecy. It told society that sexual orientation is something that is to be kept behind closed doors and kept at home, which has had deeply negative ripple effects across society. So since we were established 30 years ago, we've contributed largely to, I guess what we're most famous for is our contributions to legislative change. And we've seen a lot of legislative change relating to LGB equality, and I'm purposefully omitting the T there. Represented pictorially here, we've got the ban lifted from LGBT people serving in the military. We later saw same-sex couples able to adopt, and more recently we saw equal marriage in 2015. So in terms of laws and how LGBT people can participate in society, but also the kind of the normative implications of that as to how LGBT people are accepted and are embraced by society, we've seen some huge steps over the last 30 years. However, there's still a lot to do. And so all of these examples are really quite recent, so we still see biphobia and bi-erasure quite commonplace across society, even within the LGBT community. Just last year, we saw this headline ran in the Daily Mail saying, "Please don't pretend two dads is the new normal." And that was just last year. I know in the Daily Mail, but still. A few years ago, we saw the really harrowing attacks at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, which claimed the lives of over 100 LGBT people of color. And really acute transphobia is an issue that persists and potentially, arguably, is spiking right now. So we have conducted some research, and I'll go through that in more detail in a bit, but not just our research, but also government statistics indicate that a third of all trans people suffer hate crime in wider society. So there's clearly a lot to do, and that's really our motto in Stonewall: lots done, lots to do. I just want to shine a spotlight on trans equality as well at the moment. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm cisgender, which means that my gender is the same that was assigned to me at birth. So I'm speaking strictly as a trans ally. But I think it's important to dwell on the prominence of wider transphobic narratives that we're seeing spiking today in society. And it's really manifested strongly in the print media as well. So I think you probably have to be living under a rock to not have noticed that on a pretty daily basis, but I'll just go through I'll just give a few examples of some of the things we've seen in the last year or so that are continuing today. Even over the weekend, Stonewall itself as an organization was being dragged by a number of the British daily papers for our commitment to trans work. And this is really a daily onslaught. It's sensationalism, it's unfactual, it's purposefully misleading, and it's purposefully vilifying. And it's really breeding a toxic environment for trans people right now, which is, and one thing to acknowledge is that Stonewall itself, as I'm sure most of you will be aware, has a quite frankly checkered history when it comes to supporting trans rights. But we unequivocally stand in solidarity with the trans community right now, every step of the way. And we believe that if there's ever a time for sensitive but effective allyship, it is right now. So, cheery stuff for a nice sunny day. Unfortunately, I'm going to talk about a few statistics that don't get a lot lighter, but I just want to briefly talk about Stonewall and our work and what we do and what we can do to support various organizations. So we run the Diversity Champions program. That's our formal mechanism for engaging all kinds of employers. We've got around 800 at the moment. That we work in partnership with, and these organizations we work with to support and advise the LGBT inclusion journey. It was established about 15 years ago. It's interesting to cast your mind back to then. When the program was first launched, actually, organizations joined in secret because they didn't want to be associated necessarily openly with LGB, at the time not T, but LGB equality, which I just think is astonishing. In terms of our theory of change, we believe that there are lots of things that we need to do to harness potential and achieve LGBT equality for people of all kinds. But we believe that institutions, whether they are employers, whether they are sports clubs, whether they are educational bodies, or whether they are religious, and places of worship, we believe that they're incredibly powerful in achieving structural change to improve the lived experiences of LGBT people. And so that's why we have this partnership program. It's also a symbolic commitment, so I'm not going to pretend that everybody knows what Stonewall is or what the Diversity Champions program is, but a lot of people do, and by an organisation signing up to this program of work, it sends a very clear signal to people that this is an organisation that is committed to improving its workplace culture for LGBT people. As I said, we've got about 800 members currently, and roughly 80 of those are health and social care. So we're well represented within that sector, though with around 240, I think, health and social care organisations out there. There's still a lot more ground we could be covering. So how do we help? So there are many ways in which we can tangibly support organisations, but I'm just going to try and summarise in 3 nifty bullet points here rather than bore you all with a long shopping list. But we provide a point of contact at Stonewall for any questions and advice sought. And BSUH's client account manager is actually in the room. Where are you, Yaz? Is Yaz in the room? Oh, there we go, behind the pillar. Yeah, so Yaz is the point of contact at Stonewall for advice and guidance that the organisation might need. We also provide a framework and thematic resources to support your LGBT inclusion strategy and action plan. And we also provide opportunities to share good practice between organisations and offer assessment and gap analysis where appropriate. I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of the things we've learned over the last year. So as I mentioned at the start, one of the things I wanted to cover was our LGBT in Britain report, which is a wholesale study that looks at all aspects of LGBT people's lives. And as you can see, there's a number of different reports here. There are 6 in total. I'm only going to focus on 3 out of the interest of time. The first one I want to look at is at work, because obviously that is a large focus of today. There are many worrying stats, but I want to pick up these 3 in particular. This first one, because I think it's important to think about intersectionality and the way in which multiple oppressions overlap when we're looking at some of this. So 1 in 8 BAME LGBT employees, 12% to be precise, have lost a job in the last year because of being LGBT, compared to just 4% of white LGBT staff. That's something that it didn't shock us, because intuitively we know there are things going on to that effect, but I think the extent, the disparity, the sheer disparity of that, I think was something that gave us a lot of pause for thought, particularly in guiding Stonewall's own work and our interventions. Almost 2 in 5 bi people aren't out to anyone at work about their sexual orientation. So one of the things that the reports found was that there was, quite often we will lump LGB identities together for statistical analysis under one protected characteristic of sexual orientation. But actually when you start to break it down, you notice that there are some great disparities even between LG and B people. And in many respects, we found bi people reported some pretty high levels of bi-erasure and biphobia. We also found that more than a third of LGBT staff have hidden or disguised that they are LGBT at work in the last year because they were afraid of discrimination. Now, of course, discrimination exists in all kinds and applies to all protected characteristics. But I think there is something salient about the legacy of Section 28 and the extent to which people feel like they can bring their full selves to work, having previously been told it's something they should hide away and keep hidden. I want to dwell on the trans reports specifically. So I mentioned that there are differences between LG and B people within the community, and the experiences of trans people were really noticeably different. This isn't workplace specific, but 2 in 5 trans people have experienced a hate crime or incident because of their gender identity in the last 12 months. So that's getting on for 50%, and that's just within a 12-month period. 1 in 8 trans employees have been physically attacked by a colleague or customer in the last year. Again, a hugely appalling statistic. And I think this last stat, a quarter of trans people have experienced homelessness, I think is important when thinking about public sector partnerships and when thinking about the level of disadvantage that some people might experience and the extent to which public services need to be there to support. And finally, with this being an NHS trust, I thought it was only probably relevant to focus on the health report. So half of LGBT people said they'd experienced depression in the last year. We know that health inequalities for the LGBT community are quite acute in some areas, but especially mental health. Almost half of trans people have thought about taking their own life in the last year. 31% of LGBT people who aren't trans said the same. Again, flagging another really shocking mental health statistics. 41% of non-binary people said they'd harmed themselves in the last year compared to 20% of LGBT women and 12% of gay, bisexual and trans men. And almost 1 in 4 LGBT people have witnessed discriminatory or negative remarks against LGBT people by healthcare staff. And that one, I find very shocking. And one thing that I haven't gone through, sorry, I did one. It wasn't gonna get lighter for a moment. One thing I haven't done is talked about our unhealthy attitudes report, which looked at the experiences of LGBT healthcare practitioners. Just in the interest of time, but one of the key statistics that really shocks me in that is that 1 in 10 people, these are practitioners themselves, healthcare practitioners, have overheard a colleague expressing the belief that you can be cured for being LGBT or T. And that figure rises to 22% within London. And that's interesting because obviously conversion therapy is not something that is broadly backed up by professionals. It's certainly not sanctioned by the NHS, for example. But it's not illegal, and it happens in covert ways still. And that's actually been picked up by the LGBT action plan released by the government. So some thoroughly shocking statistics there, and I said the reason why I wanted to go through these is to really highlight the extent to which our work is not yet done. And it's perfectly possible for people not to see things going on around them and think, well, I think my friends are okay, my colleagues seem to be fine, I don't experience things myself. We would suggest that this is probably the real picture. So, the Workplace Equality Index. I'm now going to move on to the framework that we use to try to tackle some of the workplace-specific issues that organisations might face with LGBT equality. So, it runs every year, the top 100 Stonewall Workplace Equality Index. So you might see that being advertised around January time. This is the work that we do to celebrate the highest performing employers, and we every year ask those employers to submit their evidence of what they've done to us, as well as encourage staff to participate in a survey that we put out to corroborate those findings. The Workplace Equality Index, don't know why that was dropped off, just to give a few headlines about what it is. First of all, it's confidential, and the only reason why I'm divulging the statistics for this organisation today is because I've been asked to. But otherwise, unless an organisation gets into the top 100, we don't ever disclose that the organisation ever took part in the index, and that's because this isn't a naming and shaming exercise. This is a tangible tool to support organisations to do better. Many organisations treat it as a gap analysis tool, especially in the early days when they're picking up this agenda, so they will use it to shine a spotlight on some of the areas that they're just not doing kind of any work in at the moment, and use it as a framework to guide their action plan. When they participate, many organisations report finding it very useful to actually guide their ongoing work in the form of an action plan. We'd suggest that it's probably good for wider diversity work in the round. One of the things that has been improved in the index in recent years is an increased focus on intersectionality and multiple identities. We're not saying that this framework can and should be used like for all protected characteristics. We're not saying that. But what we would encourage is where organizations are thinking about some of these measures, that they also think about what that might mean for other protected characteristics too. We suggest it's a visible commitment to staff, organizations that can demonstrate that they are climbing the ranks and doing better over time, can show the fruits of their labor. And it's an opportunity for you to pat yourselves on the back for a job well done and for doing a great job so far. In terms of just some headline statistics this year, we had approximately 450 participating organizations, 445 to be precise, representing 20 different sectors across public, private, and third sector. They collectively employ getting on for 4 million employees across the UK. The average top 100 score, so this is the cohort of organizations that are performing the best, the average score was 66%, which might strike you as not particularly high, but that's because we set the bar unapologetically high. There were 8 health and social care organizations in the top 100, which, given that there are 20 sectors represented, isn't bad going at all. One thing that I would like to see is, whilst there are 8 represented in there, I would like to see some of those gaining even higher positions than our current state of play. And I think across the board, I think there are some challenges that are quite specific to this sector that I suppose I can leave for the panel later if anybody wants to hear my thoughts. As I mentioned, we also run a staff survey as well to corroborate our findings and to really get the word from the horse's mouth, I suppose, and to find out what people are saying on the ground in each organisation. And this year we had 92,500 survey participants to that, from LGBT people and non-LGBT people. So, in terms of BSUH's results, context is absolutely everything, and I would suggest the results this year were, I think it was a fantastic result for this organisation. The organisation hadn't participated in the last couple of years, so to come in at that particular rank and score, I think is astonishing. Organisations that perhaps have taken a hiatus from the index, you would expect maybe to come out 300th rank, for example. BSUH came straight in at 143, which, okay, might not be a top 100 spot yet, but I think it's excellent. A really good job. In terms of the sector average, it came 15th out of a total 54 participating health and social care organisations. So again, considering the context, I think very high. And on trans inclusion specific work, so this is work that just relates to trans identities. So there are some criteria that relates to the whole of the LGBT community, some that relate just to LGBT people, and some that relate just to trans. On the trans work, we scored just over 50%, which I think, given that we are definitely operating against a deficit model, I think shows a lot of promise. In terms of the highlights of this submission, though, I've picked out 4 key areas. So we talk about the employee life cycle. It's really clear that culture is something that's very important to this organisation from Dame Marianne's presentation earlier. One of the things we found was really strong, inclusive recruitment collateral that was really explicit about the organisation valuing diversity and showcasing its LGBT inclusion credentials. We saw all staff training material that includes LGBT identities. We saw some LGBT-specific comms going out throughout the year to mark LGBT calendar events, and we saw development and leadership opportunities flagged specifically to LGBT communities where we know there's often a deficit in take-up. In terms of the second highlight, the LGBT network group was a real source of really strong work in the submission. So there were some really clear objectives. It was clear that the network group itself offers support to colleagues and that it's there as a sounding board for any consultation within the organisation. There were also a real range of engagement activities as well, raising the visibility and the profile of LGBT identities within this workplace. So that was fantastic. Procurement. not often an area that organisations get right. Truth be told, the highlights in this section weren't necessarily about the nitty-gritty of the tendering processes, for example, of the supply chains of the organisation, but it was much more about how this organisation works collaboratively and creatively with its partners and its suppliers, sharing advice, sharing network group activities, joint community outreach. I think it's really important that organisations are diffusing all their good work and their positive impact to all of those that they work with. And finally, community engagement, I think, was probably the real highlight of this submission. So we saw some great social media activity, giving great visibility to LGBT identities and calendar events. We saw the organisation really tangibly supporting local community groups and events. And we saw lots of collaboration with other organisations as well, which is really exemplified no better than in this room today. In terms of areas for improvement, one of the areas we picked up on was staff policies and benefits, and that's not to say we're working from ground zero on this. There's lots of good stuff in the policies, so it's really a matter of tweaking things and making things more explicitly inclusive. So we'd like to see a real clear review process that picks up how the organisation considers whether its policies are LGBT inclusive and does so on a periodic basis, so it never falls behind. We'd like to see clear examples of what homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying and harassment look like in anti-discrimination and bullying and harassment policies. We'd like to see language that's consistently inclusive in family policies, for example. And we'd also like to see a transitioning at work policy that's a little bit more robust than it currently is. On allies and role models, there's some great ally activity going on right now, and I kind of gave an insight as to why I think allyship is so important at this moment of time right now. We'd like to see a real structured approach to ally participation and recruitment, and we'd also like to see a greater diversity of role models promoted across the organisation. And when I say diversity, I really mean giving real mind to intersectionality and multiple identities. And that's really just to ensure that everybody in this organisation sees themselves reflected in it. We would also like to see some gathering of data on trans identities as well. So Dame Marianne was absolutely spot on earlier about data being important because it absolutely tells a story and gives us a picture. There's some great work being done on analysis of sexual orientation, and we saw some of those headlines earlier today. We would push the organisation to think about analysis in relation to pay grades to see whether LGB and T people are reaching certain points in the organisation. And as I say, it would also be good to see some better monitoring of gender identity and trans identities. Finally, community engagement obviously was a really strong section, as I just said, and it's clear that there's a lot of good work being done on the service delivery front as well. What we'd like to see is a more systematic approach to mapping service user journeys and evidence of consulting with local LGBT service users to get feedback as to how the organisation can better support and design inclusive services. Just before I wrap up, and I'm aware I do need to quickly wrap up, I just thought I would shine a spotlight on some of the survey results. So there's some fantastic results here from what the employees of the organisation are telling us. So 97% are aware that the organisation has an LGBT network group, which is excellent and testament to the visibility of that network group. There's some above average visibility of senior managers, and I think that's exemplified by this very conference today, with 61% of LGBT employees agreeing and 67% of non-LGBT employees agreeing that senior managers demonstrate visible commitment to LGBT equality. And the same with trans equality, again, much higher than the average at 52% and 57% respectively. This is a really heartening statistic to see. So, as I said, the survey asked questions of non-LGBT people as well as LGBT people themselves, and 100% of non-LGBT employees feel confident in supporting LGBT colleagues, which I just think is wonderful. And in terms of how comfortable people feel disclosing their sexual orientation at work, as I said at the beginning, we're not operating in a vacuum here. So it's important to remember that there are reasons why people aren't out about their sexual orientation. And it's not as though we're saying every single last person should and has to be out, but it is a good indication of how comfortable people feel at work and how much they can bring their whole selves to work. And we saw 62% of LGBT colleagues feel like they're able to disclose their sexual orientation to both colleagues and to more senior members of staff. In terms of areas for improvement, the statistic around knowing reporting mechanisms for homophobic and biphobic bullying to the employer, and we've omitted the transphobic bullying statistic because there weren't enough trans-specific respondents. 54% of LGBT employees said yes, which is slightly lower than the average at 59%. Less people are aware that the organisation is a diversity champion than the overall average, but I won't assign importance to that. That would be egotistical. I'll leave you to decide how important that is. And in terms of how I would feel confident approaching my LGBT employees network group for confidential support of advice, it's just interesting here that there's a disparity. So lots of LGBT employees agree, but not so many non-LGBT employees agree, with only 53% agreeing with that statement, next to 70. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I'm aware there's a panel discussion to follow. I just want to say, just before I do finish though, that there's a lot of incredible work being done here. And of course, as ever, there's obviously more work to do, but we're really proud of our partnership with this trust. We're even more proud of the work that you're doing, and hopefully the work that we'll support. And we, and hopefully you in the room, won't stop working with public sector organisations until we achieve full acceptance for all LGBT people. Thank you very much.